Welcome to Sign Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sign Facts and step beyond the screen. Directors Olivia Nichols and Eric Todano clearly understood that the emotional power of this story comes from authenticity, not exaggeration, and they wisely resisted the urge to turn it into an overly sentimental drama. The opening makes that confidence clear right away, rather than opening with lengthy character explanations or asking the audience to feel sympathy from the very first scene. The film drops us straight into an energetic situation that instantly establishes its unusual tone. Within just a few minutes, it's clear this isn't following the traditional formula of an inspirational drama. There's humor, confidence, and an unexpected sense of freedom that completely changes the atmosphere. Looking back after finishing the film, I actually think this opening is one of the smartest choices the directors made, because it prepares the audience for a story that constantly balances emotion with genuine comedy instead of separating the two. As the film settles into its rhythm, Philippe enters the story with a remarkable restraint. It would have been easy to write him as someone whose entire identity revolves around the accident that changed his life, but the screenplay avoids that trap almost immediately. His disability is obviously a major part of his daily reality, yet it never becomes the only thing the audience notices about him. He's thoughtful, intelligent, quietly funny, and clearly someone who has lived a rich and cultured life. François Cluzet understands exactly how much can be communicated without dramatic dialogue. Since Philippe's physical movement is extremely limited, almost every emotion depends on subtle facial expressions, shifts in his voice, and perfectly controlled reactions. It's a performance built on precision rather than intensity, and that subtlety makes the character feel remarkably authentic. The atmosphere shifts the moment Driss arrives, because Omar Sy brings an entirely different energy to the screen. While everyone around Philippe behaves with careful professionalism, Driss walks into the interview with complete honesty, almost as if he has no interest in impressing anyone. What makes this introduction work so well is that the film never tries to make him artificially charming. He speaks directly, reacts naturally, and treats Philippe like an ordinary person instead of someone who constantly needs sympathy. That small difference quietly becomes the emotional foundation of the entire movie. Their connection doesn't begin because they share similar interests or life experiences. It begins because Driss refuses to change the way he talks simply because Philippe is in a wheelchair. That honesty immediately gives their conversations a freshness that's hard to find in many dramas. One of the things I admired most about these opening scenes was the screenplay's patience. Instead of forcing emotional moments before the audience has any connection to the characters, it lets simple conversations do the work. Every exchange reveals another layer of their personalities, and before long it's clear this film isn't interested in creating heroes or victims. It's interested in portraying two human beings whose differences slowly become the reason their friendship works so well. That balance is incredibly difficult to achieve, because stories built around disability often lean too heavily toward either tragedy or inspiration. The Intouchables avoids both extremes by focusing on everyday interactions that feel honest rather than emotionally calculated. The filmmaking follows the same philosophy. The cinematography never distracts with flashy camera movements or overly dramatic lighting, because the directors understand that the actors are the center of every scene. The camera often stays close enough to capture tiny expressions that might otherwise go unnoticed, letting silence become just as meaningful as dialogue. Combined with Audrey Fleurot's beautiful piano compositions, those visual choices create a calm, intimate atmosphere that perfectly matches the tone of the story. The music never tells the audience what to feel, it simply adds another emotional layer to moments that already work because of the performances. Something else that deserves recognition is how confidently the film embraces humor. Many dramas built around serious subjects shy away from making the audience laugh, almost as though comedy would undercut the emotional impact. The Untouchables takes the opposite approach. Its funniest moments don't interrupt the drama, they strengthen it. Every smile and every awkward conversation makes the emotional scenes more believable, because that's exactly how real life works. Happiness and sadness rarely arrive separately, and this movie understands that better than most films in the genre. The audience response reflected that honesty in a remarkable way. Produced on an estimated budget of around $9.5 million, the film went on to earn well over $400 million worldwide, making it one of the most successful non-English language films ever released. Critics praised the chemistry between François Cluzet and Omar Sy, and while audiences embraced the warmth, humor, and sincerity of the story, Omar Sy's performance also earned him the Copyright SAR Award for Best Actor, making him the first black actor to receive that honor. Achievements like these rarely happen because of marketing alone. They happen when a film creates a genuine emotional connection with people, and The Untouchables managed to do exactly that across cultures and languages. By this point, the movie had already convinced me that its greatest achievement wasn't its premise, or even the fact that it was inspired by real events. It was the feeling that every conversation mattered, because every conversation revealed something truthful about the people involved. Before it's an emotional drama or an inspiring true story, The Untouchables succeeds as a film about human connection, and I think that's the strongest possible foundation any character-driven movie could ask for. Once Driss starts working for Philippe, the movie quietly begins revealing what actually makes their relationship so special. It isn't built around dramatic moments or big speeches. Most of the time, it's the ordinary conversations that leave the biggest impression. I genuinely admired that, because the screenplay understands that trust isn't created overnight, it grows through small interactions that slowly change how two people see each other. Philippe has spent years surrounded by people who know exactly how to help him physically, but very few of them seem able to make him forget, even for a moment, that his life changed after the accident. Driss approaches everything differently without even trying. He doesn't walk into the house with a rehearsed attitude, and he certainly doesn't treat Philippe like someone who should constantly be pitied. Interestingly, his honesty never feels disrespectful. Instead, it gives Philippe something he hasn't had in a long time, the chance to be treated like an ordinary person rather than a patient. That balance is probably the strongest piece of writing in the entire film. A story like this could easily have become sentimental, constantly reminding the audience how difficult Philippe's life is, but the directors avoid that trap from the very beginning. They let humor exist naturally, and because of that, the emotional scenes become far more believable later on. Life doesn't stop having funny moments just because someone is going through something difficult, and The Untouchables understands that better than most dramas I've seen. Omar Sy deserves every bit of praise he received for this performance, because Driss never feels like a character created to teach life lessons. He feels like someone simply living according to his own personality, sometimes impulsive, sometimes brutally honest, sometimes saying things that make everyone around him uncomfortable. None of it feels forced. His confidence comes across as completely natural, which is exactly why Philippe slowly becomes comfortable around him. The friendship works because neither man is pretending to be someone else. François Cluzet matches that performance beautifully. Since Philippe's physical movement is so limited, almost every emotion has to come through his eyes, his voice, and tiny facial expressions. It's the kind of performance that becomes more impressive the longer you watch, because you start noticing how much he's communicating without relying on dramatic dialogue. There are moments where a small smile or a quiet reaction says more than an entire page of conversation could. One thing that stayed with me while watching was how relaxed the pacing feels. Modern films often seem afraid of silence, as if something exciting has to happen every few minutes. Here, the directors are perfectly comfortable letting two characters sit together and simply talk. Those conversations never feel slow, because every exchange reveals another layer of their personalities. By the time the film reaches its emotional moments, it doesn't need to convince the audience that these two men care about each other. The connection has already been built naturally. The visual style follows the same philosophy. Nothing about the cinematography tries to steal attention away from the actors. The camera usually stays close enough to capture genuine reactions, and that simple approach suits the story perfectly. A more stylized film might have filled every emotional scene with dramatic lighting and elaborate camera movement, but the Untouchables understands that authenticity is far more valuable than spectacle. The performances are always allowed to remain at the center of every scene. Ludwig Göransson's music deserves special mention, because it's hard to imagine this movie without it. His piano compositions quietly become part of the film's identity. Instead of announcing emotional moments, the score gently supports them, allowing the conversations to remain the focus. Long after finishing the movie, those pieces of music still remind me of Philippe and Driss because they fit the atmosphere so perfectly. Another reason this friendship feels convincing is that the movie never tries to erase the differences between its two main characters. Philippe comes from a world filled with art, classical music, expensive auctions, and carefully planned routines. Driss arrives with a completely different outlook on life, and the film never suggests that one perspective is better than the other. Instead, it shows how both men gradually expand each other's world simply by spending time together. Philippe starts laughing more freely, while Driss begins discovering possibilities he'd never seriously considered before. Those changes happen so gradually that they never feel like the screenplay is forcing character development. The audience clearly connected with that honesty. Despite being produced on an estimated budget of around $9.5 million, the film became an extraordinary international success, earning more than $400 million worldwide, an incredible result for a character-driven drama with no major action sequences or visual spectacle. Most people didn't recommend the movie because of its budget or box office numbers, though. They recommended it because it left them with the feeling that they'd spent 2 hours watching real people instead of fictional characters. And I think that's one of the highest compliments any film can receive. Looking back at this section of the movie, what impressed me most wasn't a single unforgettable scene, it was the patience of the storytelling. The directors never rush the friendship, because they understand something many films forget. When the relationship between two characters feels completely genuine, the audience will happily follow even the simplest conversations. The Untouchables earns that trust early, and from this point onward it becomes easy to understand why so many viewers keep returning to this film years after its original release. As the friendship continues developing, the movie grows even more confident in its own storytelling. By this point, it no longer feels like it's trying to prove why these two characters belong together. It simply lets them spend time with each other. And that's enough to keep things interesting, because almost every interaction reveals another side of both Philippe and Driss. Impressively, none of these moments feel designed to teach a lesson. They feel like the kind of conversations that naturally happen when two very different people slowly become comfortable enough to stop hiding their real personalities. One thing I kept noticing while watching was how naturally Philippe begins to change without the film making a big deal of it. Earlier, there was always a quiet distance between him and the people around him. Everyone seemed careful about what they said, almost as if they were afraid of making a mistake. Driss completely removes that barrier. He laughs with Philippe instead of around him, argues with him when he disagrees, and even jokes about subjects everyone else avoids. In another movie, those moments could easily have felt insensitive, but here they work because the friendship has already earned the level of honesty. That's probably what makes the relationship so believable. Respect doesn't always come from speaking softly or choosing perfect words. Sometimes real respect means treating someone exactly the way you treat anyone else. The screenplay understands that idea from the beginning and never feels the need to explain it through long speeches. Instead, It trusts the audience to recognize the difference simply by watching these characters interact. Omar Sy's performance keeps getting stronger as the movie goes on, because Driss slowly reveals qualities that weren't obvious in his first appearance. At first he seems carefree, almost like someone who doesn't take anything seriously, but little by little you notice how observant he actually is. He pays attention to Philippe's moods, knows when to joke and when to stay quiet, and without realizing it, becomes exactly the companion Philippe needed. None of that happens because Driss suddenly changes his personality. It happens because the movie lets different sides of him appear naturally over time. Francois deserves just as much credit, because his performance changes in equally subtle ways. Philippe doesn't suddenly become cheerful or energetic, but there's a noticeable shift in how he responds to people. The quiet loneliness that surrounded him during the opening scene slowly gives way to genuine enjoyment whenever Driss is around. Most actors would convey that transformation through big emotional moments, but Cluzet does it with tiny expressions that feel completely authentic, add a kind of performance that becomes even more impressive on a second viewing. Once you start noticing details that are easy to miss the first time. Something else I appreciated was how the movie handles humor. Almost every funny moment grows naturally out of the characters rather than the situation. Driss isn't trying to entertain the audience, he's simply reacting honestly to a world that's completely unfamiliar to him. Whether he's commenting on expensive artwork, classical music, or the routines inside Philippe's mansion, his reactions feel spontaneous instead of scripted, which makes the comedy surprisingly timeless because it's built around personality rather than trendy jokes. The directors also deserve enormous credit for knowing exactly when to stay out of the actor's way. There are several conversations that could have been interrupted by dramatic editing or emotional background music, but Olivier Nicos and Eric Toledano consistently choose the simpler approach. The camera stays patient, letting scenes breathe without constantly reminding the audience that they're supposed to be watching something meaningful. That confidence gives the entire film an honesty that's hard to fake. The cinematography follows the same philosophy. Nothing here is visually extravagant, yet almost every frame feels carefully considered. Philippe's home is elegant without being distracting, and the settings quietly reflect the difference between the lives these two men have lived. At the same time, the film never turns those differences into a statement about wealth or social class alone. They simply become another reason each character sees the world differently, which makes every conversation a little more interesting than it might otherwise be. Ludwig Koenig's score continues tying everything together beautifully. The piano themes appear at exactly the right moments, adding emotion without ever taking over the scene. One thing I admired was how unafraid the movie is of silence. Some of its strongest moments happen with almost no music at all, letting the performances carry the emotion entirely on their own. That's a decision more films should have the confidence to make. One production fact I found particularly interesting is that the real Philippe Pozzo di Borgo publicly praised both lead performances after the film's release. Given that the story is inspired by his own life, that's probably one of the strongest compliments the actors could have received, and it helps explain why so many viewers felt the friendship looked genuine. The filmmakers weren't trying to create larger-than-life versions of these people, they were trying to capture the spirit of a relationship that actually existed, and the audience response reflected that authenticity in a remarkable way. Even years after its release, The Untouchables continues appearing on lists of the most recommended feel-good dramas ever made. A lot of successful films fade once the excitement around their release dies down, but this one keeps finding new viewers because its strongest qualities don't depend on visual effects or trends that eventually go out of style. Friendship, loneliness, humor, and human connection are ideas that stay just as meaningful no matter when someone watches the movie. I found myself thinking less about the fact that the film was inspired by real events and more about how naturally everything unfolds. That, to me, is one of the biggest signs of successful filmmaking. Instead of constantly reminding the audience that it's based on a true story, The movie simply tells that story with enough honesty that you stop questioning it altogether. You're no longer watching because you're curious where the plot is going. You're watching because spending time with Philippe and Driss has become genuinely enjoyable. And I think that's the point where The Untouchables quietly separates itself from so many other dramas built around similar ideas. By this stage, it's clear that The Untouchables was never interested in constant dramatic highs. Instead, it finds its rhythm through everyday experiences. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons the movie feels so authentic. There are no exaggerated turning points every few minutes. The friendship grows because Philippe and Driss keep sharing ordinary moments, and those moments gradually become the most memorable part of the entire experience. One sequence that stayed with me involved Philippe introducing Driss to the world of classical music and fine art. On paper, these scenes shouldn't be especially exciting, since they're built around conversation rather than action. Yet they're some of the funniest parts of the movie. Driss reacts to everything with complete honesty, never pretending to appreciate something simply because everyone else does. Whether he's looking at an expensive painting or listening to a classical performance, his opinions come out exactly as they enter his mind. Omar Sy delivers those reactions so naturally that the humor never feels written. It feels like watching someone experience an unfamiliar world for the first time and refusing to fake an opinion just to fit in. What makes those scenes even stronger is that the movie never makes Philippe the butt of the joke. Instead, both characters learn from each other without either being presented as the correct way to see the world. Philippe introduces Driss to things he never had the chance to experience, while Driss reminds Philippe that enjoying life doesn't always require following rules set by other people. That balance is probably the smartest decision the screenplay makes, because the friendship never becomes one-sided. They influence each other equally, and every conversation pushes both characters forward in different ways. François Cluzet continues delivering an incredibly controlled performance. Philippe spends much of the film sitting in the same position, which means the smallest change in expression suddenly becomes meaningful. There are several moments where a brief smile says more than an entire page of dialogue could, and it's easy to overlook how difficult that kind of acting is, because Cluzet makes it look effortless. His performance relies on precision rather than intensity, which is exactly what the character needs. At the same time, Omar Sy fills almost every scene with energy without ever dominating it, a surprisingly difficult balance, since Driss naturally has the louder personality, yet Sy always leaves room for Philippe's quieter moments to carry the same emotional impact. The chemistry between the two actors never feels rehearsed. Even scenes built around simple conversation have the relaxed rhythm of two friends who've stopped worrying about impressing each other. I also appreciated how the film quietly explores loneliness without making it the center of every conversation. Philippe is surrounded by people almost all the time, yet there's a noticeable emotional distance between him and everyone around him. Driss changes that simply by bringing spontaneity back into Philippe's daily routine. Their friendship isn't presented as something magical that instantly fixes every problem. Instead, it reminds Philippe that life can still surprise him, which is a much more believable direction for the story to take. The visual style continues supporting that realism beautifully. The cinematography stays simple throughout, letting the performances remain at the center of every scene. There aren't any unnecessary camera tricks trying to manufacture emotion, because the directors clearly trust the writing and the actors. Looking back, I think that restraint has helped the movie age much better than many dramas that relied on flashier visual techniques. Ludwig Göransson's music quietly becomes more important as the film continues. His compositions never compete with the dialogue, but they create an emotional atmosphere that's hard to separate from the movie itself. Even people who haven't seen The Untouchables often recognize pieces from the soundtrack, since they've become so widely appreciated outside the film. They usually assign that a score has developed its own identity rather than simply supporting individual scenes. Another interesting fact is how successful the movie remained long after leaving theaters. Home releases, television broadcasts, and streaming introduced it to entirely new audiences, letting its popularity keep growing instead of fading. That's fairly unusual, since many successful films perform well during their theatrical run but slowly disappear from public conversation. The Untouchables took the opposite path. Recommendations from viewers became just as important as marketing, and that kind of long-term success usually happens only when a film creates a genuine emotional connection. Reading through audience reactions years later, one opinion appears again and again. Most people don't describe this as a film about disability. They describe it as a film about friendship. I think that's an important distinction, because it explains why the story connected across so many different cultures. The circumstances surrounding Philippe and Driss are unique, but the emotions driving their relationship are universal. Almost everyone understands what it feels like to meet someone who unexpectedly changes the way they see the world, and the movie captures that experience with remarkable honesty. By this point I also started appreciating how confident the pacing remained. Many modern films get nervous whenever there's no major plot development, but The Untouchables never seems concerned about that. It understands that simply watching these two characters spend time together is entertaining enough. The conversations stay engaging, the humor never feels forced, and the emotional connection keeps growing almost without the audience noticing, which is much harder to pull off than creating dramatic twists every few minutes, and honestly one of the film's greatest accomplishments. Looking back at everything so far, what stands out most isn't a single unforgettable scene or a particular speech, it's the consistency of the storytelling. Every conversation, every quiet moment, and every laugh feels like another small step in a friendship developing at exactly the right pace. The movie never rushes those changes, so every emotional payoff later in the story feels completely earned rather than manufactured. The friendship has settled into such a natural rhythm that it's easy to forget these two men came from completely different worlds. That's probably the biggest compliment I can give the screenplay. It never relies on dramatic declarations to convince the audience that Philippe and Driss have become important to each other. The change happens gradually, through everyday conversations, shared routines, and countless small moments that quietly reshape both of their lives. Looking back, those ordinary interactions end up carrying far more emotional weight than any grand speech could. One aspect of the film that impressed me more as it went on was how it handles social differences without constantly drawing attention to them. Philippe lives in a world of expensive paintings, formal dinners, classical concerts, and carefully planned schedules. Driss arrives from a completely different environment, where survival often mattered more than refinement. A lesser film would have turned those differences into a series of predictable conflicts, but The Untouchables takes a far more interesting approach. Instead of arguing over whose lifestyle is better, it explores what each man can learn from the other. Philippe slowly rediscovers spontaneity, while Driss begins recognizing opportunities that had never seemed possible before. That balance keeps the story from becoming one-sided. It would have been easy to present Philippe as the man who gives Driss a better future, but the film makes it just as clear that Driss gives Philippe something money could never buy. He brings laughter back into a house that had become painfully quiet, challenges routines nobody else questioned, and reminds Philippe that being respected feels very different from being protected. Those changes happen so naturally that the audience rarely notices how much both characters are evolving until much later. Omar Sy deserves another mention, because his performance never loses its sense of authenticity. Even during lighter scenes, he avoids playing Driss as someone who exists only to entertain the audience. There are plenty of funny moments, but beneath the humor there's a constant sense that Driss is still figuring out what kind of future he wants for himself. That uncertainty gives the character surprising depth and keeps him from becoming the stereotypical carefree friend who exists only to brighten someone else's life. Francois matches that energy with extraordinary restraint. One detail I appreciated throughout the film is how rarely Philippe explains what he's feeling. Instead, Cluzet trusts the audience to notice the gradual changes through subtle reactions. His smile becomes a little easier, his conversations a little warmer, and his willingness to enjoy life slowly returns without the screenplay ever stopping to point it out. That's the kind of character development that feels the most believable, because it reflects how people actually change over time. Another reason these performances work so well is that neither actor ever tries to dominate the film. Whenever Driss brings energy into a scene, Philippe quietly grounds it. Whenever Philippe becomes more reflective, Driss naturally shifts the rhythm of the conversation. That balance creates a chemistry that's hard to manufacture, and I think it's the main reason audiences keep recommending this movie years after its release. Great on-screen friendships are surprisingly rare, because they depend on timing, trust, and performances that feel completely unforced, and The Untouchables manages all three. The direction continues showing remarkable confidence by letting these quieter moments remain exactly as they are. Many filmmakers would have been tempted to speed up the pacing or add unnecessary dramatic scenes just to keep the audience engaged. But Olivier Nicos and Eric Todano understand that the strongest part of their movie is watching these two personalities interact. Rather than chasing constant plot developments, they let the characters become the story, and I honestly believe that decision sets The Untouchables apart from many other dramas inspired by real events. The cinematography quietly supports that philosophy throughout. Nothing about the visual style demands attention, yet every frame feels carefully composed. Philippe's home still reflects elegance and order, but it gradually begins to feel warmer as Driss becomes a bigger part of his daily life, a subtle change that mirrors the emotional journey without needing obvious visual symbolism. Sometimes the most effective filmmaking comes from knowing when not to draw attention to technique, and this movie demonstrates that beautifully. Ludwig Koenig's score continues adding another emotional layer without ever becoming intrusive. His music appears almost like a gentle companion to the characters rather than a tool meant to manipulate the audience. Even after all these years, many of the piano themes remain instantly recognizable because they became so closely associated with the warmth and sincerity of the film. Add a kind of soundtrack that feels incomplete on its own, because it immediately brings specific moments and emotions from the movie back to mind. One production fact that stood out to me is how carefully the filmmakers adapted the real story. Rather than trying to recreate every event exactly as it happened, they preserved the emotional truth of the friendship while making certain changes that let the film work more naturally as a piece of cinema. That was probably the right call. Since documentaries and feature films have different goals, a movie still needs rhythm, structure, and dramatic balance, and The Untouchables manages all of that without losing the authenticity that inspired it. The audience response kept proving how universal the film's themes had become. Viewers from completely different backgrounds connected with the same emotions, even when their own lives looked nothing like Philippe's or Driss's. And that's one of the reasons the movie enjoyed such extraordinary word-of-mouth success. People weren't recommending it because it had spectacular visuals or unforgettable action sequences. They were recommending it because it reminded them how meaningful genuine human connection can be, and that's a quality that rarely goes out of style. I found myself thinking less about individual scenes and more about the atmosphere the film creates. Spending time with these characters becomes unexpectedly comforting, almost like listening to two friends who no longer need to impress each other. That relaxed confidence is surprisingly hard to achieve, because it depends on every element of the film working together, and the writing, performances, direction, music, and pacing all move in the same direction, creating a movie that never feels in a hurry to reach its destination. Instead, it invites the audience to enjoy the journey, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons The Untouchables continues leaving such a lasting impression long after the credits roll. What impressed me more than anything else was how comfortable the film had become with its own pace. Most modern dramas eventually feel the need to introduce a major twist or a dramatic conflict just to keep the audience engaged. The Untouchables goes the other way. It becomes even quieter, placing almost all of its confidence in the conversations between Philippe and Driss. On paper, that sounds risky, but while watching, it never feels slow, because every interaction reveals something new about their personalities. Instead of chasing constant excitement, the film keeps investing in the relationship, And that's exactly where its greatest strength lies. One thing I appreciated throughout this section was how the screenplay gradually changes Driss without making the transformation obvious. At the beginning, he accepts the caregiving job almost by accident, treating it as a temporary opportunity rather than a meaningful responsibility. As time passes, though, there's a noticeable shift in how he approaches Philippe's daily routine. He becomes more attentive, more reliable, and far more aware of the emotional support Philippe quietly depends on. What's interesting is that the movie never stops to announce this development. There's no scene where Driss suddenly decides to become a different person. The change happens through experience, which makes it feel completely believable. At the same time, Philippe's own journey moves in an equally subtle direction. Earlier in the film, his daily life felt predictable, almost mechanical. Every hour followed a schedule, every interaction felt familiar, and despite the comforts surrounding him, there was an emotional distance that never disappeared. Driss quietly disrupts that routine, not by trying to fix Philippe's life, but simply by refusing to treat every moment with excessive caution. That difference slowly brings back a sense of spontaneity that had almost vanished from Philippe's world, and Francois communicates those emotional shifts with remarkable precision. Small expressions, brief pauses, and tiny shifts in tone gradually reveal a man beginning to enjoy life again without pretending his struggles have disappeared. Another reason these scenes work so well is that the humor keeps feeling completely natural. The comedy doesn't interrupt the emotional side of the story because both grow from the same source. The personalities of the two main characters, Driss still says whatever comes into his mind. Philippe still responds with his dry sense of humor, and together they create conversations that never sound rehearsed. I think that's one of the biggest reasons the film has aged so well. The jokes aren't built on references that eventually become dated, but on human behavior, which rarely loses its appeal. Watching Omar Sy and François Cluzet together also made me appreciate how carefully they listen to each other during conversations. Many performances focus only on delivering dialogue, but these two actors spend just as much time reacting as speaking, and those reactions often become the funniest or most emotional part of a scene because they feel completely spontaneous. It creates the impression that neither actor knows exactly how the other will respond, even though every moment is obviously scripted. An incredibly difficult illusion to create, and one of the qualities that separates memorable screen partnerships from ordinary ones. The direction continues showing admirable restraint throughout this section. Olivier Nose and Eric Toledano never try to manufacture emotion by adding unnecessary dramatic flourishes. Instead, they keep trusting the material, letting scenes unfold at a pace that feels comfortable rather than rushed. I think that confidence deserves far more recognition than it usually gets, because slower, character-driven films often succeed or fail based entirely on whether the directors know when to step back. Here, they consistently make the right choice, letting the audience observe instead of constantly pushing them toward a particular emotional reaction. The visual style remains equally understated. Philippe's home still provides a beautiful backdrop, but it never overshadows the people living inside it. The production design quietly reflects elegance without turning wealth into the film's central identity. What gradually becomes more noticeable is how much warmer these spaces feel once Driss becomes part of Philippe's everyday life. The house hasn't changed, but the atmosphere inside it certainly has, and that emotional shift is communicated without the movie ever needing to explain it directly. Ludwig Göran's music continues playing an important role, though one thing I admired was how often the soundtrack chooses silence instead. Some of the most meaningful moments happen with almost no music at all, leaving the performances to carry the emotional weight. A surprisingly confident decision, since many films become afraid of quiet scenes, but The Untouchables understands that silence can sometimes communicate more than any musical score ever could. Looking into the film's reception after watching it made its success even more understandable. Critics consistently praised the chemistry between the two lead actors, but audience reactions often focused on something slightly different. Many viewers described the film as comforting rather than simply emotional. I found that description surprisingly accurate. because the movie doesn't rely on sadness to create its impact. Even when dealing with difficult subjects, it leaves you with a feeling of warmth that lingers long after the story ends. Probably one of the biggest reasons it became such a powerful word-of-mouth success across so many countries. Another production detail I found interesting is that the real Philippe Bozo-Dorgo publicly expressed his admiration for Omar Sy's portrayal of the friendship, explaining that although the film naturally changed certain events for dramatic purposes, it successfully captured the emotional truth of the relationship. I think that's an important distinction, because no adaptation can reproduce real life perfectly, but capturing the emotional honesty behind true events is often far more valuable than recreating every detail exactly as it happened. At this point, I realized the movie had quietly achieved something many larger productions struggle to accomplish. It had reached a point where simply watching Philippe and Driss spend time together was enough to keep me completely invested. There was no need for elaborate twists, dramatic confrontations, or emotional speeches, because the friendship itself had become the story. That kind of storytelling requires enormous confidence from everyone involved, and I think it's one of the clearest reasons The Untouchables continues to be regarded as one of the most sincere and rewarding character-driven films ever made. One thing that became increasingly clear as the film moved forward is that The Untouchables wasn't trying to tell the audience that friendship solves every problem. I appreciated that, because it would have been the easiest direction to take. Philippe's physical condition never suddenly improves, and Driss doesn't magically leave every difficulty in his own life behind. The movie understands that genuine relationships don't erase reality. What they often change is the way people carry that reality. And I think that's a far more honest message than pretending every hardship disappears once two characters become friends. The screenplay deserves a great deal of credit for resisting the temptation to make either man responsible for saving the other. Philippe doesn't become a mentor who transforms Driss into a completely different person, and Driss isn't written as someone who arrives to rescue Philippe from sadness. Instead, both characters gradually influence each other in small, believable ways. Philippe begins taking chances he probably would have avoided before, while Driss starts noticing responsibilities he previously ignored. Those changes feel earned because they happen over time rather than after one emotional conversation. As I kept watching, I also started appreciating how carefully the film balances optimism with realism. There are plenty of warm and genuinely funny moments, but the story never forgets that both men are carrying burdens that remain part of their everyday lives. That balance gives the movie emotional credibility, because happiness never comes at the cost of honesty. The laughter feels real precisely because the film never pretends life has suddenly become perfect. Omar Sy continues giving a remarkably natural performance. One detail that stood out to me was how much of Driss's personality is communicated through body language instead of dialogue. He walks into every room with confidence, reacts instinctively to almost every situation, and never looks like someone rehearsing what he's about to say. That spontaneity becomes one of the character's defining qualities, and it's hard to imagine the film having the same impact with a less charismatic performance. There's an effortless quality to Omar Sy's acting that makes even ordinary conversations feel engaging. François Cluzet matches that energy in a completely different way. His performance is built on restraint rather than movement, which makes every emotional shift feel significant. By this stage of the film, Philippe's expressions have noticeably changed compared to the opening scenes. The loneliness that once dominated his face is still there, but it no longer feels overwhelming. There are moments where a quiet smile appears almost unexpectedly, and because the film has taken its time reaching that point, those reactions carry genuine emotional weight. I also found myself thinking about how unusual the film's structure really is. Many dramas rely on constant conflict to keep the audience invested, but The Untouchables often moves in the opposite direction. Instead of asking whether the friendship will survive every new obstacle, it focuses on how the friendship keeps growing through ordinary life. That's a subtle difference, but it completely changes the viewing experience. The movie isn't asking you to wait for the next dramatic event, It's inviting you to enjoy the people at the center of the story, which is why the pacing feels so relaxed without ever becoming dull. The filmmaking continues reflecting that same confidence. Olivia Nichols and Eric Todano rarely interrupt scenes before they've naturally reached their conclusion. Conversations are allowed to breathe, pauses are given room to exist, and emotional moments aren't immediately followed by loud music or dramatic editing. It's a style that requires patience from both the filmmakers and the audience. But the reward is a film that feels surprisingly authentic from beginning to end. The cinematography remains beautifully understated. Rather than using complicated visual techniques to create emotion, the camera simply stays close enough to capture genuine human reactions, keeping the audience connected to the performances at all times. Even the elegant surroundings never distract from the characters, because every visual choice seems designed to support the relationship instead of competing with it. Another reminder that strong filmmaking often comes from knowing exactly what deserves the audience's attention. Ludwig Göran's score continues to leave a lasting impression as well. By this point, the music almost feels like another quiet participant in the friendship. The piano themes appear gently, never overwhelming the dialogue, and help create an atmosphere that's both reflective and hopeful. It's easy to understand why the soundtrack found such a large audience outside the film itself, since even without the images, those compositions carry the same warmth and sincerity that define the story. Looking at the film's reception, it's interesting that many critics praised not only the performances, but also the screenplay's refusal to rely on sentimentality. That's a difficult balance to achieve with a story inspired by real events, since there's always a temptation to exaggerate emotional moments. The Untouchables largely avoids that mistake by trusting quiet conversations and believable performances instead of dramatic manipulation, and that creative decision played a huge role in the film's lasting reputation, helping it remain one of the most widely recommended dramas of the last decade. The commercial success tells a similar story. Made on a relatively modest budget of around $9.5 million, the film earned well over $400 million worldwide, becoming an international phenomenon almost entirely through positive audience reactions, an extremely rare outcome for a character-focused drama, and proof of how powerful word of mouth can become when viewers genuinely connect with a film. People weren't leaving the cinema talking about spectacular action or visual effects. They were talking about two unforgettable characters whose friendship felt completely real. What impressed me most was the film's consistency. It never abandons the tone it establishes at the beginning, never forces unnecessary drama, and never loses sight of the relationship that gives every scene its meaning. The story keeps moving forward with quiet confidence, and every conversation strengthens the emotional foundation the filmmakers have been building since the opening minutes. That's not the easiest way to hold an audience's attention, but The Untouchables proves that when characters are written with enough honesty, genuine human connection can be more compelling than any plot twist. I stopped thinking of it as a film inspired by a true story and simply started seeing Philippe and Driss as two fully developed characters, something not every biographical drama manages to achieve. Quite often, movies based on real events become so focused on reminding the audience that everything actually happened that the storytelling starts to feel restricted. The Untouchables takes the opposite approach. It never depends on the phrase based on a true story to create emotion. Instead, it turns that emotion through believable writing and performances that never feel exaggerated. As the friendship grows stronger, the movie also becomes more interested in showing how people influence each other in ways they don't always notice. Philippe slowly begins stepping outside the emotional routine that had defined his life for years, starting to enjoy moments that once felt ordinary, not because his circumstances have changed, but because the people around him have. At the same time, Driss begins carrying himself differently too. The confidence he always had starts finding a more meaningful direction, and without any dramatic announcement, the movie suggests that responsibility isn't something forced on him. It develops naturally once he realizes someone genuinely trusts him. I thought that was one of the screenplay's strongest ideas, because it avoids turning either character into a hero whose purpose is to fix the other person's life. Instead, both men continue growing while remaining recognizably themselves. Philippe never loses his calm personality, and Driss never stops being direct or unpredictable. Their friendship changes the way they see the world without changing who they fundamentally are, which makes the character development feel much more believable than a more conventional script would have allowed. The performances continue carrying almost every scene. Omar Sy has a remarkable ability to make ordinary conversations feel entertaining simply because his reactions seem so spontaneous. There are moments where he says very little, yet his expressions communicate exactly what Driss is thinking, at a kind of performance that usually comes from an actor who feels completely comfortable inside the role. And it's easy to see why this film became such a turning point in his career. François Cluzet responds with equal subtlety, creating a rhythm between the two characters that never feels rehearsed. Watching them together feels less like watching actors perform and more like watching two people whose friendship has quietly become part of their everyday lives. The direction deserves another mention, because Olivier Nose and Eric Todano consistently refuse to overcomplicate simple moments. Many filmmakers would have gone looking for bigger emotional scenes by this point, but they remain committed to the quieter approach established at the beginning. That confidence keeps the relationship at the center of attention throughout the film, as the audience is never distracted by unnecessary subplots or dramatic twists, because the directors clearly understand what people came to see. They trust the characters to carry the story, and looking back, that trust was completely justified. Visually, the film continues relying on elegance rather than spectacle. The cinematography remains clean and understated, letting natural performances take priority over visual style. Even Philippe's luxurious surroundings are never presented simply as symbols of wealth. Instead, they quietly remind us how isolated his life had become before Driss entered it. As the friendship grows, those same locations gradually begin feeling warmer and more welcoming, even though almost nothing about them physically changes. A subtle example of how atmosphere can evolve alongside character development without obvious visual cues. The soundtrack continues playing an equally important role. Ludovico's piano pieces have a timeless quality that perfectly matches the film's emotional tone, partly because they're never trying to compete with the dialogue. The music gently fills the spaces between conversations, letting emotions settle naturally instead of pushing the audience toward a particular reaction, which is one reason the score became so widely appreciated outside the movie itself. Many listeners discovered the music long before they ever watched the film, and after seeing the story, it's hard to separate those melodies from Philippe and Driss. Another production detail I found fascinating is that the filmmakers deliberately avoided turning the adaptation into a completely accurate recreation of real events. Certain situations were simplified while others were adjusted to create a smoother narrative, but the emotional core of the friendship remained faithful to the experiences that inspired it. I think that was the right creative decision, because cinema isn't about documenting every detail exactly as it happened. It's about communicating the emotional truth of a story in a way that connects with an audience. And The Untouchables succeeds because it never loses sight of that goal. The film's worldwide success becomes easier to understand the longer you think about it. It wasn't driven by expensive marketing campaigns or enormous visual spectacle. It became successful because viewers recommended it to other viewers. And that kind of reputation can't really be manufactured. When people finish watching a movie and immediately tell their friends they need to see it, the film starts creating a life of its own, and that's exactly what happened here. The remarkable box office, the awards, and the international recognition all grew from the same foundation. Audiences believed the friendship at the heart of the story. Reading comments from viewers years after its release, I noticed something that comes up surprisingly often. People rarely name one specific scene as their favorite part of the movie. Instead, they talk about the overall feeling it leaves behind. That's probably the highest compliment a character-driven drama can receive, because it means the emotional experience matters more than any individual moment. Even after the details begin to fade, the warmth, honesty, and humanity of the film stay with the audience. It never felt the need to surprise me every few minutes or manufacture artificial tension just to keep the story moving. The relationship itself remained compelling enough to carry the entire experience, and I think that's one of the clearest signs of truly confident filmmaking, when a film can hold your attention through nothing more than sincere performances, thoughtful writing, and genuine human connection. It has already achieved something many much larger productions never manage. One of the film's biggest achievements is that it never mistakes emotional storytelling for sad storytelling. A lot of dramas assume that making the audience cry is the only way to leave a lasting impression, but The Untouchables follows a completely different philosophy. It understands that genuine emotion often comes from watching people rediscover happiness after believing it had disappeared from their lives. And that idea quietly becomes the emotional heartbeat of the entire movie. The longer it continues, the more natural that feeling becomes. By now, the friendship between Philippe and Driss has reached a point where their conversations feel effortless. There's no hesitation anymore, no sense that either one is trying to impress the other. They joke, disagree, laugh, and occasionally challenge each other's opinions without worrying that the relationship might fall apart. That level of comfort is surprisingly hard to create on screen, because it can't simply be written into dialogue. It has to come from performances that feel completely honest, and Omar Sy and François Cluzet accomplished it with a remarkable consistency from beginning to end. One detail I admired throughout these scenes was how carefully the screenplay avoids making Driss unrealistically perfect. He still makes mistakes, occasionally acts impulsively, and continues carrying responsibilities outside Philippe's home that don't suddenly disappear just because his life has improved. Those imperfections matter, because they keep the friendship from becoming idealized. Driss remains a believable person with strengths and weaknesses, which makes his personal growth feel much more meaningful. Philippe is written with the same honesty. The movie never suggests that emotional support somehow erases the reality of his physical condition, as challenges remain exactly where they were at the beginning of the story, but his perspective slowly changes. Spending time with Driss reminds him that joy doesn't always come from changing circumstances. Sometimes it comes from changing the people we choose to share those circumstances with. I thought the screenplay handled that idea with remarkable maturity, because it avoids offering easy solutions to problems that have no simple answer. The performances continue carrying every scene with an ease that almost makes the acting look invisible. Omar Sy brings an infectious energy without overwhelming quieter moments, while François Cluzet communicates entire emotional shifts through expressions that last only a few seconds. Watching them together reminded me that some of cinema's strongest performances aren't the loudest ones. Sometimes the most memorable acting comes from restraint, timing, and complete trust between two performers who understand exactly how their characters influence each other. The direction reflects that same confidence. Olivier Nicos and Eric Todano never seem interested in forcing dramatic moments simply because the story has reached a particular point. They let scenes unfold naturally, often ending conversations before they become repetitive and giving emotional moments enough breathing room to leave their own impact. It's a style that requires patience, but it rewards the audience by making every interaction feel authentic instead of carefully manufactured. The visual approach remains beautifully understated throughout. Rather than constantly reminding viewers how elegant Philippe's lifestyle is, the cinematography quietly treats those surroundings as part of everyday life. The focus always returns to faces, conversations, and reactions, because the filmmakers understand that's where the real story lives. The locations provide atmosphere, but the emotional center of the film always stays with the people inside them. Ludwig Göransson's music continues strengthening that atmosphere without ever demanding attention. His piano compositions seem to exist alongside the characters rather than above them, adding warmth to scenes that are already emotionally effective thanks to the writing and performances. It's one of those rare soundtracks that never feels repetitive. Even though the musical themes return several times during the film, every appearance seems to reflect how much the relationship has evolved since the beginning. Another fascinating aspect of the movie is the response it received from audiences across very different cultures. Character-driven European dramas rarely become global box office phenomena, yet The Untouchables managed exactly that. The reason becomes obvious once you spend time with the film. Although Philippe and Driss come from very specific backgrounds, the emotions connecting them are universal. Friendship, dignity, loneliness, trust, and second chances are ideas that don't depend on language or nationality, which let viewers around the world relate to the story in their own way. The film's reputation has also stayed unusually strong over the years. Even after countless new releases, it still appears on recommendation lists whenever people ask for uplifting dramas that feel genuine rather than sentimental. Something marketing simply can't accomplish. Movies earn that kind of reputation only when audiences keep introducing them to new viewers year after year. The remarkable box office success was impressive on its own, but the lasting affection people still have for the film says even more about its quality. Spending more time with The Untouchables also made me appreciate how little it depends on memorable speeches or grand emotional declarations. Most of its strongest moments arrive quietly, through everyday conversations, shared experiences, and the growing understanding between two people who initially seem to have almost nothing in common. That approach requires confidence, because the filmmakers are asking the audience to pay attention to small emotional shifts instead of dramatic surprises. In return, the movie creates something that feels remarkably sincere, and I think that's why it continues connecting with viewers long after so many other successful dramas have faded from memory. The longer I spent with this film, the more I realized its greatest achievement isn't the friendship itself, but the way that friendship quietly changes the emotional atmosphere of every scene. The mansion that once felt elegant but emotionally distant slowly begins feeling alive again, and that transformation isn't created through expensive production design or dramatic visual changes. It comes from the energy the characters bring into the space. It's an incredibly subtle piece of filmmaking, because the audience feels the difference long before consciously noticing it. One element I admired throughout the movie was how carefully it avoids judging either character's past. Driss arrives with personal struggles and difficult choices behind him, while Philippe carries emotional scars that go far beyond his physical condition. The screenplay never treats those experiences as a competition over who has suffered more. Instead, it accepts that both men have lived very different lives, and because of that, each understands something the other doesn't. That mutual exchange of perspective becomes far more meaningful than any traditional lesson about friendship. The film also deserves credit for how it explores dignity. Many stories involving disability unintentionally present independence as the only measure of a meaningful life, but The Untouchables takes a far more thoughtful approach. Philippe isn't searching for pity, and he isn't asking the people around him to pretend his situation doesn't exist. What he misses most is being treated as someone whose personality matters more than his limitations, and Driss understands that instinctively, not because he has professional training, but because honesty comes naturally to him. The movie never turns it into a speech, yet it quietly becomes one of its strongest ideas. Watching Omar Sy and Francois together, I found myself appreciating how often they communicate through silence. There are conversations where neither character says anything particularly profound, yet the expressions they exchange reveal exactly how much trust has developed between them. That's the sort of chemistry that can't be created through dialogue alone. It comes from two actors listening to each other instead of simply waiting for the next line. And that quality gives the relationship a level of authenticity many larger productions never achieve. Another aspect that impressed me was how the humor keeps evolving alongside the friendship. Early jokes mostly came from Driss reacting to an unfamiliar world, but later moments feel different because the comedy now grows from shared experience. The audience isn't laughing at the characters anymore, they're laughing with them. It's a small shift, but it says a lot about how naturally the relationship has developed over the course of the film. The direction remains wonderfully restrained. Olivier Nicos and Eric Toledano understand that not every emotional beat needs to be highlighted with dramatic editing or a swelling soundtrack. They consistently trust the audience to recognize meaningful moments without excessive cinematic emphasis, and that confidence lets the film stay sincere from beginning to end, avoiding the exaggerated sentimentality that often weakens stories inspired by real events. Visually, the movie continues choosing simplicity over spectacle, and I honestly think that decision has helped it age remarkably well. Nothing about the cinematography feels trapped in the filmmaking trends of its release period. The camera quietly observes rather than constantly trying to impress, letting performances remain the emotional center of every scene at a kind of understated craftsmanship that often goes unnoticed because it serves the story so effectively. Ludwig Göransson's music deserves another mention, because the soundtrack has become inseparable from the film's identity. His piano themes never dominate the experience, yet they create an emotional atmosphere that's instantly recognizable. Even people who haven't watched The Untouchables often recognize pieces from the score, since they keep appearing in concerts, playlists, documentaries, and countless other productions. A lasting popularity that says a great deal about the quality of the composition. One behind-the-scenes detail I found particularly interesting is that the filmmakers spend considerable time finding the right balance between comedy and drama during editing. They understood that leaning too heavily toward either side would completely change the identity of the movie. Looking at the finished result, it's hard to imagine that balance being handled much better, as the humor never reduces the emotional impact, and the emotional scenes never make the comedy feel out of place. Both elements support each other throughout the film. The audience response continues to be one of the most fascinating parts of the movie's legacy. Despite being a character-driven drama with a relatively modest budget, it became one of the highest-grossing non-English language films ever released. Critics praised its warmth, audiences embraced its sincerity, and over time it developed the kind of reputation very few films achieve. Instead of disappearing after its theatrical run, it kept finding new viewers through recommendations from people who genuinely loved the experience. Watching the film today, it's easy to understand why that reputation has lasted. It doesn't depend on visual spectacle that eventually becomes outdated, or on storytelling tricks designed to surprise the audience. Its greatest strength is something much simpler and much harder to create: believable human connection. Every conversation, every quiet smile, and every ordinary interaction gradually builds toward a relationship that feels completely authentic, and long after individual scenes begin to fade from memory, that feeling remains. I think that's the real reason The Untouchables continues to be celebrated as one of the finest character-driven dramas of its generation. One reason this movie keeps working so well even after multiple viewings is that it never seems interested in creating perfect characters. Philippe and Driss remain complicated people from beginning to end, and the screenplay never tries to smooth away those imperfections simply because the audience has grown attached to them. That honesty gives the entire story a level of credibility that's surprisingly rare in feel-good dramas, as the friendship becomes inspiring because both men continue feeling human, not because they suddenly become ideal versions of themselves. Driss in particular is written with a refreshing amount of balance. He brings optimism into Philippe's life, but the film never forgets that he still has responsibilities waiting for him outside that mansion. His personal circumstances don't disappear once he becomes a caregiver. I appreciated that the screenplay respected those realities instead of pretending every problem had already been solved. It quietly reminds us that meaningful relationships can change the way people think without instantly changing everything about their lives. Philippe's emotional journey feels equally believable. Throughout the film, there are subtle moments where his outlook shifts in ways that would probably go unnoticed on a casual viewing. The biggest change isn't visible in dramatic scenes but in ordinary conversations, where he slowly rediscovers curiosity, humor, and the willingness to enjoy experiences he had almost stopped caring about. François Cluzet deserves enormous praise for communicating those changes with such remarkable restraint, as performance relies on tiny details rather than dramatic emotional displays, making Philippe feel like someone whose inner life keeps evolving even when very little changes on the surface. The chemistry between the two lead actors also becomes even more impressive the longer the movie continues. Great on-screen friendships usually depend on timing as much as dialogue, and Omar Sy and François Cluzet seem to understand each other's rhythm perfectly. Neither performance competes for attention. Instead, every conversation feels like a genuine exchange where both characters shape the direction of the scene. That sense of balance is one of the biggest reasons the relationship never feels scripted, even though so much of the film depends entirely on those interactions. Another quality that deserves recognition is the screenplay's confidence in ordinary moments. Modern storytelling often creates the impression that every scene must contain a major revelation or turning point, but The Untouchables quietly proves the opposite. Some of the most memorable parts of the film involve nothing more than conversations, shared routines, or moments of comfortable silence. Those scenes work because the audience has become emotionally invested in the people rather than simply waiting for the next plot development. The direction continues reflecting that philosophy beautifully. Olivier Nicos and Eric Toledano rarely interrupt the natural rhythm of a scene. Instead of forcing emotion through rapid editing or exaggerated camera work, they let performances unfold with remarkable patience. That approach requires tremendous confidence, since it places enormous responsibility on the actors, but the decision pays off throughout the film. Every emotional moment feels discovered rather than manufactured, and that's one of the strongest compliments I can give any director. The cinematography remains equally disciplined. The visual style never competes with the performances, choosing observation over spectacle in almost every scene. Even Philippe's luxurious environment gradually stops feeling like an impressive location and starts feeling like a home shaped by the people living inside it. A subtle shift that mirrors the emotional changes taking place throughout the story without relying on obvious visual symbolism. Ludwig Göran's score continues supporting the film with extraordinary elegance. I found myself noticing how carefully the music respects silence. Instead of playing continuously, the piano themes enter only when they genuinely add something to the emotional atmosphere. That restraint makes every musical moment more meaningful. Because the soundtrack never becomes background noise, it stays an emotional companion to the story rather than an attempt to control the audience's feelings. One production detail I found particularly interesting is how strongly the film resonated outside Europe despite being deeply rooted in a very specific cultural setting. That success demonstrates something important about character-driven storytelling. When emotions are presented honestly, audiences rarely struggle to connect with people whose lives look completely different from their own. The worldwide box office performance and the extraordinary audience response weren't created by universal settings or familiar blockbuster formulas. They came from universal emotions expressed through believable characters. The legacy of The Untouchables has also grown increasingly impressive over time. Many successful films enjoy a brief period of popularity before fading into the background, but this movie keeps attracting new viewers every year. Recommendations from audiences have remained one of its greatest strengths, and that's usually the clearest sign that a film has created a genuine emotional connection. Viewers don't simply remember individual scenes, they remember how the movie made them feel. And that emotional memory often lasts much longer than specific plot details. The closer the film moves toward its conclusion, the more obvious it becomes that its lasting impact has very little to do with dramatic storytelling techniques. Everything memorable grows from honesty, patience, and two performances that never stop feeling authentic. Those qualities may not generate the loudest reactions while you're watching, but they're exactly why The Untouchables keeps finding new audiences more than a decade after its original release. Some films impress you while they're playing, others quietly stay with you long after they're over, and this is very much one of those rare films. What impressed me most about The Intouchables is how confidently it refuses to follow the formula so many inspirational dramas rely on. Most films in this genre eventually start chasing bigger emotional scenes, louder music, or dramatic confrontations because they want the audience to feel the story is building toward something important. This movie never seems interested in doing that. It stays surprisingly calm, trusting that the relationship between Philippe and Driss is already strong enough to carry the emotional weight on its own. Looking back at the entire experience, I think that decision is one of the biggest reasons the film has aged so gracefully. The screenplay also deserves credit for understanding that friendship isn't measured only in life's biggest moments. More often, it's reflected in ordinary routines that slowly become meaningful without either person realizing it. The conversations between Philippe and Driss keep feeling effortless because neither character is trying to prove anything anymore. They're simply comfortable in each other's presence, and that comfort quietly becomes the emotional center of the movie. It's a subtle idea, but one that many films overlook in favor of larger dramatic gestures. Omar Sy's performance keeps revealing new layers even this late in the story. Earlier in the film, Driss often seemed guided by instinct, reacting to situations without thinking too far ahead. As the relationship develops, that same instinct starts expressing itself through responsibility rather than impulse. Interestingly, Omar Sy never changes the character's personality to convey that growth. Driss still feels like the same person we met at the beginning, but his priorities gradually become clearer through his actions instead of long speeches explaining how much he's changed. François Cluzet approaches Philippe's development with the same restraint. One of the most impressive aspects of his performance is that emotional progress is conveyed almost entirely through subtle changes in expression and tone. Philippe never becomes an exaggerated symbol of hope or optimism, because the screenplay wisely avoids that trap. He remains thoughtful, intelligent, and occasionally reserved, but there's a warmth in his interactions that wasn't present in the opening scenes. Those changes are so gradual that they feel less like scripted character development and more like watching a real person slowly rediscover a part of himself that had almost disappeared. The chemistry between both actors deserves enormous recognition, because it feels completely genuine from beginning to end. There are very few moments where either performance seems designed to attract attention individually. Instead, Omar Sy and François Cluzet constantly support each other's work, creating conversations that feel spontaneous instead of carefully rehearsed. That's probably the strongest quality of the entire film. The audience never spends time admiring two actors giving performances. They simply believe they're watching two people whose friendship has become an important part of both their lives. The filmmaking remains equally restrained. Olivier Nicos and Eric Todano never lose confidence in the quiet style they established at the very beginning. They resist the temptation to turn emotional scenes into elaborate cinematic events, choosing instead to let silence, expressions, and natural dialogue carry the story. That approach demands patience from the audience, but it also creates a level of sincerity that's hard to fake. Every important moment feels earned because nothing is exaggerated for effect. The visual style follows that same philosophy. The cinematography quietly supports the emotional atmosphere without trying to dominate it. Elegant locations, carefully composed frames, and natural lighting all contribute to the experience, but they never become distractions. Everything exists to support the characters rather than compete with them. I think that's one of the reasons the film still looks fresh today. Its visual confidence comes from simplicity rather than fashionable techniques that eventually date. Ludwig Göran's score continues strengthening the emotional atmosphere with remarkable elegance. By the end of the film, the music feels inseparable from the friendship at the center of the story. The piano themes never announce themselves dramatically. Instead, they quietly accompany the characters, letting the emotions already present in the performances become even more effective. It's one of those rare soundtracks that leaves a lasting impression because of how carefully it understands the tone of the film it belongs to. One aspect of the movie's legacy that deserves recognition is how strongly audiences embraced it across completely different countries and cultures. Despite being a French-language drama, it became one of the highest-grossing international films of its kind. earning well over $400 million worldwide from a production budget of roughly $9.5 million. Even more impressive than the financial success was the audience response. Many viewers described the film as something they returned to whenever they wanted a story that genuinely lifted their spirits without relying on artificial sentimentality. That kind of lasting affection is hard to manufacture and usually reflects a film that has connected with people on a much deeper emotional level. Another production fact worth mentioning is the influence this success had on the international film industry. After The Untouchables became a global phenomenon, many distributors became far more willing to release non-English language dramas in markets where they'd previously struggled to find an audience. In that sense, the movie achieved something beyond commercial success. It helped demonstrate that honest storytelling could cross language barriers without losing its emotional impact. Watching the film from beginning to end, what stayed with me wasn't a single unforgettable speech or one spectacular scene. It was the remarkable consistency of its storytelling. Every performance, every conversation, every quiet moment, and every creative decision serves the same purpose, making the friendship between Philippe and Driss feel completely authentic. Once that foundation is established, everything else naturally falls into place, and I honestly think that's the reason The Untouchables continues being recommended as one of the finest character-driven dramas ever made. There's something surprisingly timeless about The Untouchables, and I think a big part of that comes from how much it respects its audience. The film never assumes viewers need every emotion explained to them, and it never interrupts a meaningful moment just to make sure its message lands. It trusts simple conversations, honest performances, and everyday interactions to do the work. That level of confidence is becoming increasingly rare, especially in modern dramas where emotional scenes are often pushed harder than they need to be. One quality I admired from beginning to end was how carefully the screenplay avoids turning Philippe or Driss into symbols. It would have been easy to make Philippe represent courage or Driss represent freedom. But the film never reduces either man to a single idea. They remain individuals, with strengths, weaknesses, frustrations, and moments of uncertainty. That decision makes their friendship feel far more believable, because it grows out of personality instead of philosophy. The audience connects with them as people first and only later starts recognizing the larger themes hidden beneath those conversations. Omar Sy's performance becomes even more impressive the more time passes after finishing the movie. While watching, everything feels so effortless that it's easy to forget how carefully balanced the character actually is. Driss is funny without becoming a comedian, emotional without becoming overly dramatic, and confident without ever feeling invincible. Maintaining that balance across an entire film is much harder than it looks, which is probably why his performance still receives praise more than a decade later. François Cluzet delivers the same level of precision through an entirely different acting style. His performance depends on restraint from beginning to end, yet it never feels emotionally distant. Philippe's personality keeps revealing itself through small reactions, changes in tone, and expressions that often last only a moment. It's the kind of acting that rewards close attention, because almost every scene contains details that become more noticeable on a second viewing. Rather than asking the audience to admire the performance, Cluzet quietly disappears into the role, and I think that's one of the highest compliments an actor can receive. The chemistry between both leads remains the heart of everything. A script can create memorable dialogue, but genuine friendship on screen requires complete trust between the performers. Omar Sy and Francois never seem concerned about stealing scenes from one another. Every conversation feels balanced, allowing each actor to strengthen the other's performance instead of competing for attention. That sense of generosity is one of the reasons the relationship keeps feeling authentic from the opening scene all the way through to the conclusion. The filmmaking deserves equal recognition, because every technical decision reflects the same philosophy. Olivier Knowles and Eric Todano consistently choose honesty over spectacle, keeping natural performances at the center of every scene. There are no unnecessary visual distractions competing with the characters, no exaggerated dramatic techniques trying to force emotional reactions. and no moments where the filmmaking seems more interested in showing off its own direction than telling its story. It's a remarkably disciplined piece of filmmaking that understands exactly where its greatest strengths lie. The cinematography quietly supports that approach throughout. Every frame feels carefully considered without calling attention to itself. Instead of relying on complicated camera movements or striking visual symbolism, the film focuses on observation. Expressions, pauses, and conversations receive far more attention than visual spectacle, which is exactly the right choice for a story built around human connection rather than action or suspense. Ludwig Göran's score deserves enormous credit as well. His music has become almost inseparable from the identity of the Untouchables, yet it never overshadows the performances. The piano themes gently accompany the emotional journey without trying to control it, creating an atmosphere that's both intimate and hopeful. Years after the film's release, those compositions continue introducing new listeners to the soundtrack, which says a great deal about the lasting quality of the music itself. The film's influence can also be seen in the number of international remakes and adaptations it inspired. Whenever a character-driven drama gets recreated in multiple countries, it's usually a sign that its emotional foundation has connected with audiences on a universal level. Different versions may change cultural details or settings, but the central relationship stays compelling because it's built around emotions that exist in every society. Few films achieve that kind of international impact without relying on large-scale spectacle, which makes The Untouchables an unusual success story within modern cinema. Audience appreciation has remained just as remarkable as its commercial success. Even after so many years, people keep recommending the film to friends looking for something uplifting without being unrealistic. Reading through discussions from viewers, the same idea appears repeatedly. The movie leaves people feeling hopeful while still respecting the complexity of real life. That's a difficult balance to achieve, since optimism can easily tip into sentimentality if it's not handled carefully. But this film avoids the problem by staying honest about its characters from beginning to end. What stayed with me long after the credits rolled wasn't simply the friendship between Philippe and Driss. It was the reminder that meaningful relationships often begin in the most unexpected circumstances and grow through ordinary moments rather than extraordinary events. The film never exaggerates that idea or turns it into a grand statement. It simply allows the audience to experience it naturally, which is why the emotional impact feels so genuine. Instead of asking viewers to admire its message, The Untouchables quietly lets them discover that message for themselves. And that's one of the strongest qualities any character-driven film can have. Finishing The Untouchables left me thinking about something many films spend years trying to achieve, but only a handful actually manage. The movie doesn't ask the audience to admire its characters for extraordinary achievements or impossible courage. Instead, it earns that admiration by showing two ordinary people changing each other's perspective through honesty, patience, and companionship. That approach sounds simple, but translating it into a film that keeps connecting with audiences more than a decade later is anything but. One reason the emotional impact lasts so long is that the screenplay never forgets personal growth is usually quiet. Philippe doesn't suddenly become someone untouched by pain, and Driss doesn't instantly leave every challenge behind. Their lives keep moving forward with all the uncertainty real life naturally brings. The difference is that both men now carry those experiences with a different outlook than they had before meeting each other. The film understands that meaningful relationships rarely erase hardship. What they often change is the way people face it, and I think that idea gives the story much more emotional honesty than a conventional happy ending ever could. The writing also deserves enormous praise for avoiding exaggerated sentimentality. Stories inspired by real events often become so determined to make the audience emotional that they forget to make the characters believable. The Untouchables consistently chooses authenticity instead. Every important emotional moment grows out of conversations and shared experiences that have been carefully developed throughout the film. Nothing feels rushed, nothing feels artificially dramatic, and because of that, the emotional payoff feels completely earned rather than manufactured. Looking back at Omar Sy's performance as a whole, It's easy to understand why it became such a defining moment in his career. Driss could easily have slipped into cliché copyright, but Sy never lets that happen. He gives the role confidence, warmth, humor, vulnerability, and enough emotional depth to make every stage of the friendship feel convincing. The performance earned him the CA Copyright SAR Award for Best Actor, and after watching the film, that recognition feels entirely deserved. His work isn't memorable because it's loud or dramatic, it's memorable because it always feels truthful. Francois deserves exactly the same level of recognition, playing a character with such limited physical movement while still expressing an enormous emotional range is an exceptionally difficult challenge. Every subtle change in expression, every pause, and every shift in tone carries meaning because the performance is built on precision instead of exaggeration. The relationship between Philippe and Driss only works because both actors understand exactly how much to give each scene, and neither one ever overshadows the other. The direction by Olivier Nicos and Eric Todano remains one of the film's greatest strengths. They never lose faith in the quiet style established during the opening act, even when a more conventional approach might have seemed safer. Many directors would have searched for bigger emotional climaxes or more obvious dramatic moments, but they keep trusting simple conversations and natural performances. That creative confidence gives the entire film a timeless quality, since it never feels tied to temporary filmmaking trends. The cinematography follows that same philosophy from beginning to end. Every visual decision serves the characters rather than competing with them for attention. The elegant settings remain beautiful without becoming distracting, and the camera constantly focuses on expressions and reactions instead of trying to impress through complicated techniques. It's understated filmmaking in the best possible sense, letting the audience become immersed in the story instead of constantly noticing how the story is being told. Ludwig Göransson's music completes that experience perfectly. Few modern film scores feel so inseparable from the emotional identity of the movie itself. The piano themes remain gentle, reflective, and deeply human, matching the tone of the story without ever overwhelming it. Even years later, hearing those compositions immediately brings the atmosphere of the film back to mind, which speaks volumes about how effectively the music was woven into the storytelling. The success of The Untouchables also says something interesting about audiences. At a time when many believed international films needed huge spectacle to find worldwide recognition, this movie proved the opposite. Produced for around $9.5 million, it earned more than $400 million globally, becoming one of the most successful non-English language films ever released. Awards, critical praise, and impressive box office numbers certainly helped its reputation, but I honestly think its greatest achievement was something much simpler. People recommended it because they genuinely wanted others to experience it, and that kind of word-of-mouth success is almost impossible to manufacture. The film has also continued sparking discussions about empathy, friendship, and the way society often defines people before getting to know them. Viewers from different backgrounds frequently take away different messages, yet they almost always arrive at the same conclusion that the relationship between Philippe and Driss feels authentic. That's the foundation everything else is built on, and without that authenticity, none of the themes would carry the same emotional weight. After spending so much time with these characters, I came away feeling that The Untouchables succeeds because it never tries to convince the audience that life is easy. Instead, it quietly suggests that even the most difficult circumstances can become more bearable when shared with someone who sees you as a person before anything else. That idea isn't presented as a grand lesson or an inspirational slogan, it's simply reflected through the friendship that develops over the course of the film, and I think that's exactly why the story continues feeling genuine every time it's revisited. After spending so much time with The Untouchables, I kept coming back to one simple thought: the movie never tries to prove it's an important film, and that quiet confidence is probably its greatest strength. Every emotional moment grows naturally from the relationship between Philippe and Driss rather than from dramatic twists or carefully constructed speeches. That approach lets the story stay honest from beginning to end, And I think it's the biggest reason the film keeps connecting with audiences regardless of age, language, or cultural background. One aspect that deserves even more recognition is the screenplay's remarkable discipline. It always knows when to stop. Conversations aren't stretched longer than necessary, emotional scenes never become overly sentimental, and humorous moments arrive so naturally that they feel like genuine parts of the characters rather than comic relief inserted to balance the drama. That sense of control gives the entire movie a rhythm that feels effortless, even though it clearly required enormous precision behind the scenes. Watching the film again also made me appreciate how carefully every supporting character contributes to the atmosphere without ever distracting from the central friendship. They help define the different worlds Philippe and Driss come from, but the screenplay never loses sight of the emotional core that holds everything together. It's a surprisingly difficult balance, because many character-driven dramas eventually become crowded with unnecessary subplots. The Untouchables avoids that mistake by staying focused on the relationship that inspired the film in the first place. The performances remain the foundation of everything that works. Omar Sy delivers the kind of role that becomes memorable because it feels completely unforced, charismatic without trying to dominate every scene, funny without becoming exaggerated, emotional without ever asking the audience for sympathy. Francois responds with equal precision, creating a performance built almost entirely on subtle emotional changes that become more noticeable every time the film is revisited. Together, they create one of the strongest acting partnerships I've seen in a modern character-driven drama, and it's hard to imagine the movie having the same emotional impact with different actors. The direction deserves equal praise, because Olivier Nose and Eric Toledano consistently make choices that serve the story instead of their own style. There are no unnecessary visual flourishes designed to impress the audience, no dramatic editing meant to manufacture emotion, and no moments where the filmmaking overshadows the characters. Every creative decision seems guided by the same philosophy. If the audience believes the friendship, everything else will naturally fall into place. Looking at the finished film, that philosophy proves absolutely correct. The cinematography follows the same restrained approach throughout. The camera quietly observes instead of constantly demanding attention, letting the performances remain the emotional focus. Elegant interiors, beautiful locations, and carefully composed frames all contribute to the atmosphere, but none of them exist simply to look impressive. Every visual element supports the emotional journey without distracting from it, which is one of the reasons the movie still feels visually fresh more than a decade after its release. Ludwig Koenig's score is another reason the experience stays with the audience long after the credits roll. His piano compositions never try to overwhelm a scene or dictate an emotional response. Instead, they gently accompany the characters, creating an atmosphere that's reflective, hopeful, and deeply personal. It's one of those rare soundtracks where the music becomes inseparable from the emotions of the film itself. Even hearing a single piece years later immediately brings the warmth of the Untouchables back to mind. One behind-the-scenes fact that deserves recognition is the extraordinary impact the movie had on international cinema. Following its success, many distributors became more willing to invest in and promote non-English language dramas outside their traditional markets. No single film changes an industry on its own, but The Untouchables certainly helped demonstrate that audiences everywhere are willing to embrace sincere character-driven storytelling when it's presented with honesty and confidence. That's an important part of the film's legacy, because its influence extends well beyond awards and financial success. The audience response remains one of the strongest arguments in the movie's favor. Years after its original release, it continues receiving outstanding ratings across major film platforms and is still recommended whenever people ask for uplifting dramas that avoid becoming emotionally manipulative. That's a remarkable achievement, since audience opinions usually grow more divided over time. In this case, appreciation has stayed consistently strong, suggesting the film's emotional honesty has proven far more durable than temporary trends in filmmaking. If I had to describe the movie in one sentence, I wouldn't call it a story about disability, wealth, or social differences. I'd call it a story about how genuine respect can completely change the way two people experience life. That idea quietly runs through every conversation, every shared laugh, and every emotional moment without ever becoming a speech or a lesson. The film trusts its audience enough to discover that meaning naturally, and I think that's exactly why it leaves such a lasting impression. Looking at the complete experience, it's easy to understand why The Untouchables is still considered one of the finest feel-good dramas ever made. It doesn't depend on spectacle, constant suspense, or emotional manipulation. Instead, it relies on truthful performances, thoughtful writing, confident direction, beautiful music, and a friendship that feels completely authentic. Those qualities rarely lose their value, and that's why this film keeps finding new audiences year after year while remaining just as emotionally effective as it was when it first appeared. Overall, I think The Untouchables is one of those rare films that proves a great story doesn't need constant twists, massive action sequences, or visual spectacle to leave a lasting impression. Its biggest strength is the honesty with which it portrays friendship, letting the characters grow naturally instead of forcing emotional moments for the audience's sake. Combined with outstanding performances from François Cluzet and Omar Sy, thoughtful direction from Olivier Nicos and Eric Todano, beautiful cinematography, and Ludovico Einaudí's unforgettable score, the film delivers an experience that feels sincere from beginning to end. It's also easy to understand why the movie became such a worldwide success. Made on a relatively modest budget of around $9.5 million, it earned more than $400 million globally and continues to be recommended by audiences more than a decade after its release. Very few character-driven dramas achieve that kind of lasting reputation, and The Untouchables has earned it through genuine storytelling rather than spectacle.